Hey, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Before we begin tonight, one small thing. If this channel has become part of your evenings, if the voice and the slow drift of history feel like the right way to end a day, would you consider subscribing? A like helps more than you might think. No pressure. Do it when it feels right. Dim the lights, pull your blanket up, get truly, properly horizontal. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. A bedroom in Seattle, a sofa in Georgia at midnight. I read every single one. There is something I find genuinely wonderful about that. All these different people, in all these different places, settling in at the same time to hear the same story. Tonight we're going to New York. Not the New York you know. The one behind iron gates and velvet curtains, where the flowers alone cost more than most families earned in a month. You would not have survived this dinner. Not because of the food, but because of the rules, because of the watching, because of what it meant to make a single wrong move. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. Now. Picture this. It is an evening in the autumn of 1888. The light is going early now, the way it does in New York in October, pulling itself below the rooftops of Fifth Avenue, before most of the fashionable households have even finished dressing. The gas lamps are being lit along the street. You can hear, if you stand outside and pay attention, the sound of carriage wheels on stone, the particular percussion of iron shoes on cobblestones, the soft whicker of horses waiting. Every house on this stretch of Fifth Avenue has its windows lit from within, warm rectangles of amber light behind velvet drapery, and from the largest of these houses, the one with the limestone facade and the wrought iron gates and the stone urns filled with late chrysanthemums, there comes, very faintly, the sound of an orchestra tuning. This is the Whitmore house, and tonight, Margaret Whitmore is giving a dinner. Not a dinner in the way you and I use the word, not 12 people around a table with a pot roast and a bottle of something reasonable. A dinner, in the language of the Gilded Age, meant something closer to a military operation. It meant weeks of planning. It meant correspondence with Delmonico's and with the florist on Madison Avenue and with the wine merchant on Broad Street. It meant a printed menu in French, obviously, because English menus were for people who did not know better. It meant a table set with enough silver and crystal to stock a small museum. And it meant, above everything else, a guest list assembled with the kind of strategic precision that modern generals reserve for troop movements. Margaret has been planning this dinner for 3 weeks. She's 34 years old, which in the Gilded Age puts her at the height of her social power. She married well, which is to say she married into money rather than being born into it, which creates its own particular kind of pressure, the kind that makes you careful. She's dressed tonight in a gown of deep green silk, worth of Paris, obviously, because the label mattered as much as the dress, with ivory gloves that reach past her elbows and a necklace of emeralds that her husband gave her on the occasion of the birth of their second child. Her hair has been arranged by her maid, a French woman named Cécile, who has been with her for 4 years and who understands, without being told, that tonight is not an ordinary night. The dining room is ready. It has been ready since 4 in the afternoon, which is when Margaret did her final walk-through, bending slightly to check the alignment of the crystal, running one gloved finger along the edge of the table to check for dust, examining each place, setting with the focused attention of someone who knows that everything she's looking at will be judged. And it will be. Every piece of it. Let me walk you into that room. Let me describe it as it is right now, before the guests arrive, before the orchestra shifts from tuning to the first low notes of a Strauss waltz, before the first carriage disgorges its passengers at the front door. The table seats 24. It is not the largest table in New York that season. Some of the great houses seat 36, 40, even more for particularly grand occasions. But 24 is a number that allows for serious conversation, which is paradoxically both the stated purpose and the last thing most guests actually accomplish. The table is covered in white damask linen, pressed so precisely that the fold lines form a perfect grid. In the centre, running the full length of the table, is an arrangement that the society columns will describe tomorrow as a garland of hothouse roses and trailing fern, interspersed with gilded pine cones and clusters of ivory candles in silver holders. 37 candles in total. Margaret counted them herself. Each place setting contains 14 pieces. 14. 3 forks on the left, 3 knives on the right, 2 spoons, 2 glasses for wine already in position, a water goblet, a champagne flute, and a sherry glass to be added during the first course. A bread plate with its own small butter knife. A menu card in a silver holder, printed in French in a script typeface Margaret selected from samples sent by the engraver. And a handwritten place card also in French, bearing the name of each guest in Cecile's careful copper plate. The footmen are stationed already, 6 of them in livery, white-gloved, standing at intervals around the room with the stillness of people who have been trained to not exist when they are not actively needed. This is its own skill, by the way, the ability to stand in a room full of wealthy people for hours and radiate invisibility. The butler, an Englishman named Hargreaves, who Margaret poached from a household on the Upper East Side 2 years ago and has never once regretted it, is making a final inspection of the wines. There are 7 of them for this evening, a dry sherry to begin, then a white burgundy with the fish, a different, richer white with the soup, because this is how it was done, not lightest to heaviest in any simple way, but according to a logic Margaret learned from Hargreaves and from the formidable Mrs. Astor's social secretary, whose opinion on wine service is considered close to law in the better houses. A claret with the roast, a champagne, because there is always champagne, a sweet sauterne with the dessert courses, and a port for the gentlemen later, in the library, after the ladies have withdrawn. Because ladies withdrew, this is worth pausing on. After dinner, in the world we're visiting tonight, the meal did not simply end. It split. The women rose, and the men rose with them, briefly and ceremonially, and then the women left the room and the men sat back down. The women went to the drawing room. The men stayed at the table and drank port and smoked cigars and talked about whatever men of this class talked about when women were not present, which was largely business, politics, and other men's money. The women sat in the drawing room and talked about whatever women of this class talked about when men were not present, which was largely other women, marriages, children, and the social calendar. After 45 minutes or an hour, the men joined them, and the evening continued with coffee and petits fours and more conversation, and then at some reasonable hour everyone left. This ritual, the separation after dinner, was not peculiar to the Gilded Age. It came from England. Most things did in the social world of New York in the 1880s. The better houses on Fifth Avenue looked to London for guidance on everything from architecture to table manners, and the withdrawal of ladies after dinner was an English practice that had been imported wholesale, along with the butler, the livery, and the habit of calling the first meal of the day breakfast even when it was eaten at 11. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The guests have not arrived yet. It is 7:45 in the evening. The first carriage is pulling up to the gate. Dinner is at 8, which means the first guests will arrive at 8:15, because arriving at the precise hour stated on an invitation is, in this world, considered slightly common. You arrive after the hour, not so late that it becomes an insult, not at the hour itself which suggests you are waiting. Somewhere in the territory of 10 to 20 minutes past is correct, unless you are very grand, in which case you may be 25 minutes past and no one will say anything to your face. The first couple to arrive tonight are the Athertons. Thomas Atherton is a banker of the kind that means something specific in New York in 1888, which is to say he is not new money, but he is not truly old money either. He occupies that particular shelf of the social architecture that has been there for 2 generations, and smells of respectability without quite reeking of the centuries. It is an evening in the autumn of 1888. The light is going early now the way it does in New York in October, pulling itself below the rooftops of Fifth Avenue before most of the fashionable households have even finished dressing. The gas lamps are being lit along the street. You can hear, if you stand outside and pay attention, the sound of carriage wheels on stone, the particular percussion of iron shoes on cobblestones, the soft whicker of horses waiting. Every house on this stretch of Fifth Avenue has its windows lit from within, warm rectangles of amber light behind velvet drapery, and from the largest of these houses, the one with the limestone facade and the wrought iron gates and the stone urns filled with late chrysanthemums, there comes very faintly the sound of an orchestra tuning. This is the Whitmore house, and tonight Margaret Whitmore is giving a dinner. Not a dinner in the way you and I use the word. Not 12 people around a table with a pot roast and a bottle of something reasonable. A dinner, in the language of the Gilded Age, meant something closer to a military operation. It meant weeks of planning. It meant correspondence with Delmonico's and with the florist on Madison Avenue and with the wine merchant on Broad Street. It meant a printed menu in French, obviously, because English menus were for people who did not know better. It meant a table set with enough silver and crystal to stock a small museum. And it meant, above everything else, a guest list assembled with the kind of strategic precision that modern generals reserve for troop movements. Margaret has been planning this dinner for 3 weeks. She is 34 years old, which in the Gilded Age puts her at the height of her social power. She married well, which is to say she married into money rather than being born into it, which creates its own particular kind of pressure, the kind that makes you careful. She is dressed tonight in a gown of deep green silk, worth of Paris, obviously, because the label mattered as much as the dress, with ivory gloves that reach past her elbows and a necklace of emeralds that her husband gave her on the occasion of the birth of their second child. Her hair has been arranged by her maid, a French woman named Cécile, who has been with her for 4 years and who understands, without being told, that tonight is not an ordinary night. The dining room is ready. It has been ready since 4 in the afternoon, which is when Margaret did her final walkthrough, bending slightly to check the alignment of the crystal, running one gloved finger along the edge of the table to check for dust, examining each place setting with the focused attention of someone who knows that everything she is looking at will be judged, and it will be. Every piece of it. Let me walk you into that room. Let me describe it as it is right now, before the guests arrive. Before the orchestra shifts from tuning to the first low notes of a Strauss waltz, before the first carriage disgorges its passengers at the front door. The table seats 24. It is not the largest table in New York that season. Some of the great houses seat 36, 40, even more for particularly grand occasions. But 24 is a number that allows for serious conversation, which is, paradoxically, both the stated purpose and the last thing most guests actually accomplish. The table is covered in white damask linen, pressed so precisely that the fold lines form a perfect grid. In the center, running the full length of the table, is an arrangement that the society columns will describe tomorrow as a garland of hothouse roses and trailing fern, interspersed with gilded pine cones and clusters of ivory candles in silver holders. 37 candles in total. Margaret counted them herself. Each place setting contains 14 pieces. 14. 3 forks on the left, 3 knives on the right, 2 spoons, 2 glasses for wine already in position, a water goblet, a champagne flute and a sherry glass to be added during the first course, a bread plate with its own small butter knife, a menu card in a silver holder, printed in French in a script typeface Margaret selected from samples sent by the engraver, and a handwritten place card, also in French, bearing the name of each guest in Cecile's careful copper plate. The footmen are stationed already, 6 of them in livery, white-gloved, standing at intervals around the room with the stillness of people who have been trained to not exist when they are not actively needed. This is its own skill, by the way. The ability to stand in a room full of wealthy people for hours and radiate invisibility, The butler, an Englishman named Hargreaves, who Margaret poached from a household on the Upper East Side 2 years ago and has never once regretted it, is making a final inspection of the wines. There are 7 of them for this evening, a dry sherry to begin, then a white burgundy with the fish, a different, richer white with the soup, because this is how it was done, not lightest to heaviest in any simple way, but according to a logic Margaret learned from Hargreaves and from the formidable Mrs. Astor's social secretary, whose opinion on wine service is considered close to law in the better houses, a claret with the roast, a champagne because there is always champagne, a sweet sauterne with the dessert courses, and a port for the gentlemen later in the library after the ladies have withdrawn, because ladies withdrew. This is worth pausing on. After dinner, in the world we are visiting tonight, the meal did not simply end, it split. The women rose, and the men rose with them, briefly and ceremonially, and then the women left the room and the men sat back down. The women went to the drawing room. The men stayed at the table and drank port and smoked cigars, and talked about whatever men of this class talked about when women were not present, which was largely business, politics, and other men's money. The women sat in the drawing room and talked about whatever women of this class talked about when men were not present, which was largely other women, marriages, children, and the social calendar. After 45 minutes or an hour, the men joined them, and the evening continued with coffee and petit fours and more conversation. And then at some reasonable hour everyone left. This ritual, the separation after dinner, was not peculiar to the Gilded Age. It came from England. Most things did in the social world of New York in the 1880s. The better houses on Fifth Avenue looked to London for guidance on everything from architecture to table manners, and the withdrawal of ladies after dinner was an English practice that had been imported wholesale, along with the butler, the livery, and the habit of calling the first meal of the day breakfast even when it was eaten at 11. But I am getting ahead of myself. The guests have not arrived yet. It is 7:45 in the evening. The first carriage is pulling up to the gate. Dinner is at 8, which means the first guests will arrive at 8:15, because arriving at the precise hour stated on an invitation is, in this world, considered slightly common. You arrive after the hour, not so late that it becomes an insult, not at the hour itself, which suggests you are waiting. Somewhere in the territory of 10 to 20 minutes past is correct, unless you are very grand, in which case you may be 25 minutes past and no one will say anything to your face. The first couple to arrive tonight are the Athertons. Thomas Atherton is a banker of the kind that means something specific in New York in 1888, which is to say he is not new money, but he is not truly old money either. He occupies that particular shelf of the social architecture that has been there for 2 generations and smells of respectability without quite reeking of the centuries. His wife Frances is wearing a gown of pale blue satin and carries a fan of ivory and painted silk that she opens and closes with the unconscious frequency of someone who learned to carry a fan in her teens and has been doing it for 20 years without noticing. Frances Atherton is the kind of woman who never makes an obvious social error. She will not be the most sparkling person in the room tonight. She rarely is. But she will also never be the one people talk about afterward. And tonight, in the particular social ecology of a Gilded Age dinner party, not being talked about afterward is itself a form of achievement. Behind the Athertons come the Whitfields, then the Callaways, then the extraordinary Mrs. Eugenia Price Mortimer, who arrives alone because her husband is in Newport, and who manages to make arriving alone seem like a distinction rather than a social irregularity. Margaret receives each couple in the drawing room before dinner, standing near the fireplace in a position that is not accidental. The fireplace in a room like this one is the most architecturally dominant point in the space. Standing near it puts the hostess at the visual center without requiring her to move to greet people. They come to her. This is how it works. This is how everything in this world works, with a certain amount of invisible engineering behind every gesture that looks natural. She extends her hand to each guest with the right degree of warmth calibrated to the guest. more warmth to the Athertons, whom she genuinely likes and who are her husband's allies, correct warmth to the Whitfields, whose social position is technically slightly above hers and who know it, a particular warmth, genuine and slightly conspiratorial, to Eugenia Price Mortimer, whom Margaret finds genuinely amusing and slightly dangerous, and who she always puts near the middle of the table where she can entertain without derailing things. All of this, every calibration, every adjustment, every positioning, happens in real time, without apparent thought, the way a skilled musician plays without looking at the keys. Now, here is what I want to show you. Here is the thing that will end you if you walked in off the street tonight. You have made it through the drawing room. You have shaken the right hands, or rather extended your own in the right way. Because in 1888 a woman does not shake hands the way a man does. She extends her fingers loosely and allows the gentleman to bow over them or barely touch them. A firm handshake from a woman is considered, depending on your circle, either very American in a bad way or vaguely alarming. You have made acceptable small conversation, which means you have talked about the weather, the opera season, and a safe 3 sentences about some recent news item that does not risk offending anyone. You have complimented your hostess on the flowers without overdoing it. You have accepted a glass of sherry without drinking too much of it too fast. You think you are doing all right, and then Hargreaves appears in the doorway and announces dinner in his measured, slightly theatrical baritone, and everything you thought you knew is about to become useless. The procession to the dining room is not random. Nothing in this world is random. Guests go into dinner in a specific order determined by social rank, and getting it wrong, being confused about where you fall in the order, hesitating when you should move, moving when you should wait, is a mistake that will be noticed. The host offers his arm to the highest-ranking lady present, and they lead. The hostess goes in last, on the arm of the highest-ranking gentleman. Between those 2 poles, everyone else falls into place according to a hierarchy so established and so detailed that there is an entire chapter in Ward McAllister's book about it. Ward McAllister. I need to tell you about Ward McAllister because he is one of the strangest and most important figures in this story. Ward McAllister was a Georgian-born social climber who arrived in New York in the 1860s with charm, a good tailor, and an encyclopedic interest in the rules of high society. He attached himself to Mrs. William Astor, who was the undisputed queen of New York society, and spent the next 30 years as her chief ally, advisor, and enforcer of social standards. He is the man who coined the phrase the 400, referring to the number of people who actually mattered in New York society, supposedly because only 400 people could fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, and therefore only 400 people were worth inviting. This sounds like a joke. It was not a joke. Or rather, it was a joke that people organized their entire lives around not being left out of. McAllister wrote a book called Society as I Have Found It, published in 1890, in which he explains with complete seriousness and considerable detail the correct way to give a dinner party, the correct ratio of courses, the correct wines, the correct order of precedence, the correct way to seat guests relative to each other, because seating was not merely practical, it was political. Where you sat at the table told everyone in the room exactly how your hostess assessed your social position. Getting seated next to the hostess meant you were important. Getting seated in the middle of the table, what they sometimes called the Siberia of the table, was an unmistakable message. You were there because you had to be invited. You were not there because you mattered. Mrs. Whitmore, our Margaret, has thought about nothing else for the last week. The seating. She has moved the cards a dozen times. She has consulted Hargreaves. She has considered every possible combination of personalities, every possible conversational pairing, every potential social landmine that could be diffused in advance by the simple act of putting 2 people as far from each other as a 24-person table allows. Because at a dinner party in the Gilded Age, the conversation is both the entertainment and the currency. What you say, how you say it, who you say it to, who overhears it, who repeats it later, All of this circulates through the social world of New York like water through a very small, very complicated, very well-dressed ecosystem. You have found your card, you are seated, and now the soup arrives. The soup is turtle soup, clear, golden, with a faint bite of Madeira, served in wide, shallow bowls of Limoges china, each bowl resting on a gilt service plate that will be removed when the soup is done. The footman places yours from the left. He removes dirty plates from the right. If he gets this confused, if he serves from the right or removes from the left, every person of consequence at this table will notice, and Hargreaves will hear about it before the fish course arrives. You pick up your spoon. This is where it gets complicated. Which spoon? There are two on your right. The larger one is for the soup, but you need to use it in a very specific way, not by plunging it toward you and drinking from the bowl end closest to you. That is incorrect and will be noticed. You tip the spoon away from you, which seems counterintuitive, I know, and you sip from the side of the bowl, not from the tip. No slurping, no blowing on the soup to cool it, no resting your spoon in the bowl between sips. You rest it on the service plate, and please, under no circumstances do you tip the bowl. Tipping the soup bowl to get the last of the soup is considered so gauche, so absolutely beyond the pale, that in certain households the story of the guest who tipped the soup bowl was still being told 15 years after the event. You leave the last half-inch of soup in the bowl. You simply leave it. The footman will take it. This is the bargain. The soup is so good, the Madeira is perfectly judged, the bowl is beautiful, and you leave some of it behind because that is what people of this table do. After the soup comes the fish. This is where the silverware situation intensifies. The fish fork is longer and thinner than the dinner fork, with a slight notch near the base of the outer tines that is specifically designed for separating fish flesh from bone. You use it only for fish. Do not confuse it with the dinner fork, which comes later. The fish knife is on your right, and it is not a sharp knife in any meaningful sense because the convention in American households is that fish is delicate and should be encouraged to part rather than be cut. You are essentially using a blunt implement to separate a piece of sole or salmon or whitefish into portions small enough to lift to your mouth with the fish fork, and you are doing this while maintaining a conversation with the person on your left, which Hargreaves has already started, and the person on your right, whose turn comes in alternate courses. Alternate courses, that is the rule. You speak to the person on your left during one course. You turn to the person on your right for the next. The hostess signals these turns. If she turns, you turn. If she is still speaking to one direction, so are you. There is a story in the journals of a Boston socialite from around this time period about a woman who failed to notice the hostess's turn and continued speaking to her left partner through an entire second course, while her right-hand partner sat in complete conversational neglect. It was, by the account of 3 separate witnesses, excruciating. Now, let us talk about what you are allowed to say. This is, I think, the part that modern people find most bewildering, because the rules about dinner table conversation in the Gilded Age are not just about volume or profanity, they are about entire categories of subject matter that simply do not exist at the dinner table. Money is not discussed, not in any direct form. You do not ask a man what he earns. You do not mention the cost of anything, not the gown, not the house, not the furniture. You may admire things obliquely. What a beautiful service, you might say, or these flowers are extraordinary. But you do not say, I wonder what those hothouse roses cost this time of year, even though every person at the table is wondering exactly that. And the answer is that they cost more than a working seamstress earns in a month. Politics is available, but carefully. You may speak of political matters if they are sufficiently elevated and sufficiently unlikely to create genuine argument. National character is acceptable. The tariff question is manageable if you keep it abstract. The labor question is not discussed at a table like this one, or rather it is discussed in the way that people discuss a distant weather system, as something real and possibly inconvenient but happening to other people in other places. Religion is avoided almost entirely, not because people don't have religious views, they most certainly do, but because the religious landscape of New York in the 1880s is complicated enough, with its old Dutch Reformed families and its Episcopalian social elite and its Catholic immigrant communities arriving in waves, that the dinner table is simply not the place to have that particular conversation. You mention God in passing in the way that speech of this era does routinely. You do not start theological debates over the claret. Illness is not discussed. Your own health is not a dinner topic. If you are unwell, you do not come to dinner. If you come to dinner, you are well, or you perform wellness well enough that the distinction is academic. The one exception is that a brief and dignified mention of a recent illness already resolved is acceptable as an explanation for a gap in the social calendar. I have been quite confined these past weeks, you might say, and people will understand and will not ask for details. Death is the strangest one. Death is discussed, but only at a certain remove. The death of a mutual acquaintance delivered with appropriate gravity and appropriately brief condolence before moving to another subject is fine. The death of a public figure is fine. Your own fear of death, your own proximity to loss, the actual texture of grief, these do not come to the table. The Gilded Age dinner party operates in a kind of sealed present tense where the overwhelming reality of mortality is acknowledged in the abstract and not permitted to take up actual space. This is not coldness exactly, or not only coldness. It is also a kind of social contract, an agreement that this particular time and place is for something else, and that the weight of life's harder truths will be carried some other way, in other rooms, at other hours. You are managing. Somehow, impossibly, you are managing. The soup is finished and did not shame you. The fish is half gone. Your conversation with the person on your left has navigated successfully through the opera season. A brief discussion of the current exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, and a safe 3 minutes on a recent election result that both of you managed to discuss without actually saying what you think. You have not touched the wrong fork. You have not slurped. You have not tipped anything. And then it happens, your bread roll. It has been sitting on the small plate to your left untouched, because you did not want to reach for it before you were certain it was the right moment. And now you are certain. You pick it up. You are about to put it in your mouth. Put it back down. You do not bite bread in the Gilded Age. You break it with your fingers, a small piece one bite at a time broken off from the roll, and then, if you wish, you butter it, but not by pressing the roll against the butter and drawing it across like a razor strop. You use the small butter knife on the bread plate. You put a small amount of butter on the bread plate itself, not on the roll, and then you use that same knife to put a small amount of butter on the small piece of bread you have just broken. One piece at a time. Every piece has its own trip to the butter. You do not butter the whole roll in advance and eat it. I realize this sounds insane. You are going to simply agree with me that it sounds insane, and then trust me when I tell you that any deviation from this process at a table like Margaret's tonight would have been as visible as a shout. Between the fish and what Margaret's menu card calls releves, which translates roughly as the course that comes before the main and after the first removes, which is itself almost exactly as confusing as it sounds, the footman removes the service plates and replaces them with fresh ones. During this brief interval, the table becomes, very briefly, a landscape of small sounds and movements, the clink of crystal, the soft percussion of silverware being repositioned. Someone in the direction of Eugenia Price Mortimer laughs, low and brief, the kind of laugh that makes everyone in earshot curious about the joke. This is the social texture of the thing. Not the food, not the china, not the extraordinarily complicated cutlery protocol. It is this, the particular quality of a room full of people performing their best selves in close proximity and occasionally, briefly, letting something real slip through. Let me tell you about the table itself, because it deserves its own moment. The centerpiece, that 37-candle arrangement of roses and fern and gilded pine cones, was not chosen only for beauty. Centerpieces in the Gilded Age served a structural function. They were, in effect, a visual barrier that ran the length of the table and prevented direct eye contact between guests seated on opposite sides. This was considered useful. Eye contact across the full width of the dining table was thought to invite a certain kind of interaction, a reaching across the social space that the formality of the occasion was designed to contain. The person across from you was, in a sense, in a different conversation. The centerpiece made that physical fact architecturally legible. There is something I find genuinely interesting about this. The whole design of a Gilded Age dinner table was built to enable conversation while also very precisely limiting its range. You could speak to the person on your immediate left or right. You could not easily speak to the person across the table. You could not shout down the table to someone at the far end as people did in medieval great halls, because the table was too long and the convention too strict. You were in effect in a series of small bubbles, each bubble complete in itself, each conversation contained. The silver at the table deserves its own mention too. The Whitmore silver is not new. One of the strategic decisions Margaret made when she moved into this house was to keep her mother-in-law's silver rather than commissioning a new set, because the mother-in-law's silver is heavier, more elaborate, and visibly older, and visible age in silver says something important in a world where new money is always slightly suspect. Old silver says the family has been giving dinner parties for generations. New silver says you just got the money and you are still figuring out how to spend it. The difference is not subtle to the people at this table. They have been reading silver the way other people read faces for their entire adult lives. By the fourth course, something has settled in the room. It is one of the peculiar atmospheric qualities of a well-run Gilded Age dinner. This shift that happens somewhere around the middle, when the wine has been flowing for an hour and the conversation has found its grooves and the initial anxiety of performing correctly has burned off to something warmer. Not exactly relaxed, because no one at this table is ever exactly relaxed, but settled, at ease within the performance, the way a stage actor settles into a role midway through the second act. The lines are known, the blocking is familiar. You can start to enjoy it. For some people, there are always a few people at a dinner like this who are never quite enjoying it, who are calculating throughout. A young woman in her first real season who is intensely aware that tonight is an audition as much as a dinner, that the impression she makes on Margaret Whitmore and on Eugenia Price Mortimer and on the 3 or 4 other women of consequence at this table will follow her through the social season in ways she cannot yet fully predict. A man of middle standing who has been invited because he is useful, and who knows he has been invited because he is useful, and who navigates the evening with the particular careful precision of someone who is never quite sure of his footing, and perhaps most interesting of all, the woman seated 3 places to Margaret's left, a Mrs. Cordelia Langford, who has been attending dinners like this one for 23 years, and who therefore has long since stopped performing, and now simply exists in these rooms with a calm authority that younger women mistake for contentment, and that is actually something closer to a long settled truce. Cordelia Langford is worth watching. Watch her. She eats correctly, of course, and effortlessly. The fork business, the bread business, the spoon business, all of it has become so deeply habitual over 2 decades of dinners that she no more thinks about it than you think about how to walk. She speaks easily and precisely. She knows exactly how much to say and when to stop. She does not overstay a subject. She has over the years developed what you might call a social ear. The ability to hear not just what is being said, but what kind of response is being asked for. Some questions want information. Some questions want reassurance. Some questions are not questions at all, but small territorial gestures, affirmations of standing. And she answers all of these correctly, giving each one exactly what it needs without giving it more. What she thinks about any of it is another matter entirely. There is a story about a woman like Cordelia, perhaps not this woman specifically, but one of a type that appears repeatedly in the diaries and letters of Gilded Age New York. A woman who reached her mid-40s and realized that she had spent the better part of her adult life becoming extraordinarily skilled at something that interested her very little, and who could not stop, because the skills she had were the skills the world she lived in rewarded, and there was no parallel world available to her that rewarded anything else. I want to be careful here not to project backward. Not every woman at a table like this one was secretly miserable and yearning for something different. Some of them genuinely loved this, genuinely loved the theatre of it, the strategy of it, the craft of it. Some found real pleasure in the social architecture, in managing the room the way Margaret managed it, in the particular satisfactions of a dinner that works. And those satisfactions are real. Creating something this elaborate and this successful is an achievement by any reasonable standard. But the structure meant that there was no other path. The woman who would have preferred to be an economist or a doctor or a judge had to express whatever intelligence and drive she had through the dinner table and the morning call and the charity committee and the management of an impossibly complicated household. The dinner party was where the mind went because there was nowhere else for it to go. This is what makes Gilded Age social life so interesting and so heavy simultaneously. It is not an empty spectacle. There are real minds behind it, real skill, real labour, real ambition. It is just that all of this was channeled into a form so constrained, so elaborate, so defined by rules that no one had chosen, that even the most brilliant woman at the table was operating with one hand, or perhaps both hands, tied. But let me not stay in abstraction when there is so much more concrete, specific, sensory history to share with you. Because the dinner is not done. We have not gotten to the roast. We have not talked about the champagne which arrives with a small fanfare. We have not discussed what happens after dessert, or the rules for the drawing room, or the way the evening ends, or any of the dozen other rituals that make a Gilded Age dinner party the kind of thing that takes 6 hours and leaves you the following morning, slightly stunned that it was possible to spend that long doing something so precisely choreographed and so deeply human at the same time. Let us slow down now. Let us settle into the middle of the evening, the part where the room is warm and the candles are burning lower and the wine is doing what wine does, which is make people feel that the conversation is more significant than it probably is, and the evening more beautiful than it will look in memory. The roast has arrived. In the Gilded Age, the roast course, the relevé or the roti, was often the centerpiece of the meal in a practical sense, the thing everyone had been working toward. At Margaret's table tonight, it is a saddle of lamb carved at the sideboard by a footman under Hargreaves's watchful eye, served with a sauce the cook has been working on since this morning, with potatoes prepared in the French style and a timbale of vegetables that is both decorative and correct. The claret that accompanies it is from a bottle Hargreaves selected 2 days ago. He opened it this afternoon so it could breathe. The colour in the glass is the particular deep red of a Bordeaux at the right age, not too young and sharp, not too old and faded, and the smell of it, if you are positioned correctly at the table, mingles very faintly with the smell of the lamb and the candles and the flowers and the wool of the men's evening coats. That smell, that specific combination, I find it genuinely difficult to describe without being there, but I want to try because it is the sensory core of the thing. There is warmth in it, not the aggressive warmth of too many people in too small a space, but a regulated, managed warmth. The warmth of a room that has been deliberately prepared to receive people, where the temperature has been considered. There is the waxy sweetness of 40-odd candles burning at their peak. There is food, obviously complex and layered, the particular richness of a French-inflected Victorian kitchen that has been cooking for 16 hours. And underneath all of it, there is something harder to name, the smell of occasion, of formality, of a certain kind of effort. It smells like it means something, because it does mean something. That is the thing to hold on to as the evening progresses. All of this elaborate, expensive, exhausting ritual is doing real work in the social world. It is confirming relationships and communicating status and building alliances and resolving small tensions and creating new ones. It is the mechanism by which the top of New York society reproduces itself, night after night, season after season, across the brownstones and the limestone mansions of a city that in 1888 is in the middle of becoming one of the great financial capitals of the world. The money is extraordinary. That is the other thing to hold in mind. The Gilded Age gets its name from Mark Twain, who coined the phrase in the early 1870s to describe the thin layer of gold that covered the social surface of the era, glittering and decorative and concealing what lay beneath. It was not a compliment. Twain was a journalist and a satirist, and he was deeply skeptical of the great fortunes being assembled in his lifetime, skeptical of the men who assembled them, and even more skeptical of the social world those fortunes supported. But the scale of the wealth was real. By the 1880s, New York was home to a concentration of private wealth that the world had simply never seen before. The Industrial Revolution had been running for decades, producing railroads and steel mills and oil refineries and textile factories on a scale that generated fortunes so large they became genuinely difficult to comprehend. A man like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built the railroad empire and died in 1877, left an estate valued at approximately $100 million, which was at the time roughly equivalent to the entire annual federal budget of the United States. One man, one estate. His children were spending it. The social world we are visiting tonight, the world of Margaret's dinner and the Whitmore silverware and Hargreaves and the 37 candles and the 7 wines, was built on that kind of money. It did not exist as an end in itself. It existed as a demonstration, a very expensive, very elaborate, very carefully managed demonstration that you were a person who belonged to the world defined by that money, or that you aspired to belong to it, or that you were at least comfortable enough in its company that its rules came naturally to you. The rules are the proof. That is the key insight about the Gilded Age dinner party, and the reason I keep coming back to the specifics of how you held your fork, and how you broke your bread, and which direction you turned when the hostess turned. These rules are not arbitrary, even though they seem arbitrary. They are a test, and the test is ongoing. Every course is a new question. Every glass of wine is another moment in which you are either confirming or undermining someone's assessment of whether you belong here. This is not comfortable. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to sort. The woman in her first season at the table tonight, let us call her Miss Eliza Forsyth. She feels this acutely. She feels it in the slight tightening of her shoulders that she has been trying to relax for the past 2 hours. She feels it in the way her attention never quite settles, moving constantly from her own hands to the hostess, to her left-hand partner, to her right-hand partner, to the footman who is refilling the claret, and who she has been told not to make eye contact with, which is correct, though she is still not entirely sure why. Miss Forsyth is 20, which is young for a dinner like this one. She is here because her mother is a friend of Francis Atherton's, which is itself a chain of social connection, long enough that her presence at this specific table is something of a minor achievement for the family. Her father is in commerce. Not the wrong kind of commerce, nothing vulgar, but not quite the right kind either. Not banking or law or the professions that produce the kind of money that has social weight. She has been instructed by her mother with an earnestness that bordered on severity, to be charming and careful and not to talk too much or too little, and not to ask questions about money or politics or health, and to listen more than she speaks. She has been listening. She has been listening so intently that she has eaten about half as much as she should have, and has spoken perhaps 2/3 as much as she should have, calibrating incorrectly in the direction of caution, and the man on her right has been aware of this, and has been making gentle, patient, conversational overtures that she has been answering in ways that are technically correct, but somehow not quite enough. And he has privately decided she is probably shy rather than dull, which is the better of the 2 assessments she might receive. She will manage the evening. She will not make any obvious errors. She will be spoken of, in the conversations that happen in carriages and morning rooms in the days that follow, as a pleasant girl, perfectly nice. Not brilliant, but certainly not alarming. Her mother will receive a note from Francis Atherton that strikes the right note of measured encouragement, and Eliza will be invited again somewhere, not here, not this level, but somewhere that is an improvement on where she started. This is how social ascent worked in the Gilded Age. Slowly, carefully, Through a series of dinners and morning calls and correctly returned invitations and not quite visible efforts that accumulated over years into something you could call position. And position, in this world, was everything. Let me tell you about Delmonico's, because you cannot talk about Gilded Age dinner parties without talking about Delmonico's. Delmonico's was a restaurant, but that word does not do justice to what it actually was. It was the finest restaurant in the United States from roughly the 1830s through the 1890s, and arguably the most influential in American culinary history. It was founded by Swiss immigrants, the Delmonico family, and it introduced New York, and through New York the rest of America, to the concept of the restaurant as we understand it today. Fixed price menus printed in French, individual tables rather than communal ones, a wine list curated with actual thought, service by trained waiters rather than whoever happened to be available. The idea that dining could be an experience rather than a necessity. For the Gilded Age social elite, Delmonico's served two functions. It was the place you went when you wanted the best food in the city without the effort of producing it yourself, which is to say it was the backdrop for business dinners, celebratory meals, and the kind of courtship that required a neutral ground. And it was the place you hired when you wanted to give a dinner party at home that matched restaurant standards. The Delmonico's kitchen would send a chef or a team of cooks or occasionally an entire brigade to your house on Fifth Avenue and produce in your kitchen the same caliber of food they produced in their own. This is what Ward McAllister did for some of the dinners he organized, and what the grander hostesses of the era did for their most important occasions. It was very expensive and it was worth it. Because a dinner catered by Delmonico's announced something. It announced that you took this seriously, that you had the money and the social intelligence to know that this was how things were done at the top. Margaret's dinner tonight is not Delmonico's as it happens. Her cook, a French woman named Madame Renard, who arrived from Lyon 7 years ago, and who produces food of a genuinely high standard, has done this work herself. But the menu, the structure, the sauces, the presentation, all of it is Delmonico's adjacent, which is to say it follows the same logic, the same French vocabulary, the same understanding of what a formal dinner of this tier is supposed to be. The champagne arrives now. It always arrives with a kind of uplift, a small lightening of the atmosphere that is partly the wine itself and partly what the wine signals, which is that the evening is going well, that we have gotten this far together, that the remaining courses will carry us home. Champagne in the 1880s was considerably sweeter than what we drink today. The great champagne houses of France had not yet moved toward the dry styles that became fashionable later in the century. What was poured at a table like this one would be, to our palate, more like a sweet sparkling wine, with a richness and a cloying edge that pairs very well with the courses that surround it, but might surprise anyone expecting the dry bite of a modern brute. The glasses are shallow coupes, the wide flat kind, not the tall flutes that came later. There is a story, probably not true but very persistent, that the shape of the champagne coupe was modelled on the breast of Marie Antoinette. It is the kind of story that people in 1888 New York told each other with an air of mild scandal and general delight, and its veracity is less important than what it tells us about the atmosphere in which the drink was consumed. At Margaret's table, the champagne is poured, and the conversation shifts briefly, collectively, to the kind of warmth that champagne always produces in a room of people who have been together for 2 hours. Someone makes a toast. Not an elaborate one, this is not the moment for a speech, but a brief gesture of the glass and a word or two that acknowledges the occasion. The glasses rise and touch, with a sound like small bells, and for just a moment the room is unified in a way it was not before. These moments, these brief unscripted moments of genuine shared warmth inside the larger structure of the performance, they are the reason people kept giving dinner parties, not the silverware, not the French menu, not the social calculation of who sat where, but these moments when the room moved briefly together and something real happened between people who spent most of their time carefully managed. Let me tell you now about the rules of conversation in greater detail, because we touched on them earlier and they deserve more than a touch. The Gilded Age dinner party conversation operated on a principle that is, once you see it, visible everywhere in the social life of the era, which is the principle of carefully managed revelation. You revealed things, but you chose with precision what you revealed and what you withheld. And the skill of a good conversationalist was in the selection. You could talk about art, but with a lightness that suggested you were enjoying it rather than studying it, because too much seriousness about aesthetics could come across as pedantic, which was a social crime. You could talk about travel, which was one of the great subjects, because travel in the 1880s meant something very specific. It meant Europe. It meant Paris and Rome and London and possibly Egypt, which had become fashionable after a famous artist or two had gone there and reported back on its picturesque quality. Talking about your time in Europe was acceptable not because it was interesting, but because it was proof. It proved you could afford to go. It proved you had the taste to know why you went. And it gave everyone at the table something to share in or compare or embellish. You could talk about people, which was perhaps the richest vein of Gilded Age dinner conversation. But carefully, you praised the people who were above you in the social order, which was easy because the social order was clear and everyone knew it. You praised them in a way that was genuine enough to seem warm, but controlled enough to not seem sycophantic. You were neutral or gently absent about the people at your own level, because there was political complexity in every direction, and you said almost nothing about the people below you, or rather you said nothing in a way that betrayed your awareness of the hierarchy, because acknowledging that a hierarchy existed was considered slightly vulgar. Everyone knew it existed, no one said it directly. The correct vocabulary was exclusion rather than condemnation. You simply did not mention certain people, certain addresses, certain events. The silence was eloquent. Thomas Atherton, the banker, is currently discussing a recent political situation with some obliqueness and considerable skill. He has an opinion on it that is quite firm, but he is presenting it as a series of careful observations that can be agreed with or quietly differed from without anyone feeling they have been pinned down. This is a technique that men of his position develop over years of business dinners, where the actual stakes are higher and the need for strategic positioning more obvious. He has brought it to the social dinner table, where it serves him nearly as well. His wife Frances is discussing something with the man on her right that involves a great deal of genuine animation on her part, which is unusual for Frances, who is generally more contained. Whatever the subject is, it has broken through her social exterior into something more alive. She is leaning slightly forward, her fan is still, her eyes are direct. She is in this moment actually present in the conversation rather than present in the dinner party, which is a subtle but important distinction. Margaret, watching from her end of the table, notices this. She notices everything. The work of giving a dinner like this does not stop at the preparation. It continues through the evening in the form of surveillance, gentle and constant. Who is talking to whom? Who seems uncomfortable? Where the energy of the table is and where it has gone flat? Who needs to be drawn out and who needs to be gently contained? This ongoing management of the room is the most invisible part of the hostess's labor and the most demanding. It requires a kind of attention that is split between performing her own dinner party self and observing everyone else's. Now, I want to take a small step back from the table. I want to take you outside for a moment. Just for a moment, just long enough to see this evening from the outside of it. From the street, from the sidewalk along Fifth Avenue on this October night in 1888, the Whitmore house looks like this. It is a large limestone building, 4 stories, with large windows on the first 2 floors framed by decorative moulding. The windows of the dining room are on the right side of the 2nd floor, and from the street you can see the warm, even glow of the candles, a kind of steady amber light that flickers slightly when a footman passes nearby but is otherwise constant. You cannot hear the conversation. You cannot smell the lamb or the claret or the waxy candles. You can only see that glow and hear, very faintly if you stop and listen, the low murmur of sound that 24 people make when they are speaking at regulated volume in a room designed for it. On the sidewalk in front of the house, the carriages are waiting. The coachmen are sitting up on their boxes, bundled against the October chill, some of them talking quietly to each other, most of them simply waiting in the particular patient stillness of people who are paid to wait. One of the horses stamps a foot. There is a shift of harnesses, the jingle of metal, and then stillness again. Inside that house, one of the greatest social performances of its era is in full swing. Out here on the stone pavement in the cold night air, the horses wait and the coachmen wait, and the gas lamps cast their small circles of yellowish light on the stone, and the city moves around all of it with no particular concern for whether the dinner party is going well. The city was not always welcoming to this world. This is something the social histories of the Gilded Age sometimes underplay. The extraordinary concentrated wealth of Fifth Avenue and the brownstones of Murray Hill and Gramercy Park existed in a city that was, in 1888, under enormous pressure. Immigration was arriving in quantities that the city's infrastructure was struggling to absorb. The Lower East Side, just a few miles from where Margaret's candles are burning, was among the most densely populated places on Earth. The tenements that Jacob Riis would photograph and describe in his 1989 book How the Other Half Lives, a book that caused a genuine sensation and forced some reckoning with what the city actually contained, were full of families living in conditions that have to be experienced in imagination to be believed. No running water, no heat, multiple families in spaces designed for one, children working, disease, the particular darkness of genuine urban poverty. And Margaret knows this, in the way that everyone in her world knows it, in the abstract, in the way that allows the knowledge to exist without becoming personal. She gives to charity, as everyone in her circle gives to charity, because charitable giving is part of the social architecture. It is expected and it is real and it does some genuine good, but it is also structured so as not to threaten the fundamental arrangement. You give within the system. You do not question the system, or if you question it quietly, in your drawing room, in your own conscience, and not at the dinner table where this kind of questioning is off the list. The claret is nearly gone. The champagne glasses have been refilled. There is a pause between the meat course and the dessert, a small breathing space, and in this space the room is doing what rooms do when good food and wine have been doing their work for several hours. It is comfortable, genuinely, warmly comfortable. The candles have burned about a third of the way down. The roses in the centerpiece have opened more fully in the warmth of the room. Someone is laughing, a real laugh, not a social laugh, somewhere toward the other end of the table from Margaret, and the sound of it is briefly delightful. This specific moment, the room at its warmest, the candles at their mid-burn, the evening passing from the disciplined first half to the warmer second half. This is why the Gilded Age dinner party endured. Not because the rules were pleasant. They were not pleasant, or not only pleasant, but because when it worked, when all the machinery of silver and crystal and French menus and carefully managed seating and 7 wines and 6 footmen was running correctly, it produced this, a room full of people at their best, or at least at their most skillfully presented, moving through an evening that was, whatever else it was, undeniably beautiful. Let us have dessert. The dessert course at a Gilded Age dinner was not one thing, it was several things. It was the point at which the table, which had maintained its relative severity for the preceding courses, opened up into something more abundant and more obviously pleasurable. The strict course discipline of the earlier evening gave way to a profusion of small offerings that were partly food and partly spectacle. First came what the French menu called the entremets sucrés, the sweet side dishes, in this case a moulded charlotte russe, which is a dessert of Bavarian cream set in a mould lined with ladyfinger biscuits and unmoulded at the table with a kind of theatrical precision that Madame Renard has been perfecting for 7 years. Next to it, on a silver tray, an assortment of small pastries, macarons, not the modern kind, the French discs of flavoured meringue and buttercream that we know now, but the original kind, almonds and sugar and white, crisp and light and faintly chewy at the centre, petit fours in 3 kinds, a blancmange set in a decorative copper mould, and surrounded by a ring of candied violets that are edible and that several of the women at the table will eat with a particular careful pleasure, lifting each small purple thing with a dessert fork and experiencing it as both flavour and experience. There are sugared almonds in small dishes placed at intervals down the table. There is crystallized fruit in another dish, the kind that has been slowly cooked in sugar syrup over several days until each piece is translucent and jewel-like and tastes intensely, almost alarmingly of itself. A large piece of crystallized pineapple is among them, and the pineapple deserves a small historical note because pineapples were still significant objects in the 1880s, symbols of wealth and hospitality that had been used as decorative centerpieces before they were edible ones, and having actual crystallized pineapple at the dessert course said something about the household. The sauterne arrives with the dessert, and it is sweet and gold and cold, poured into smaller glasses than the ones used for the claret, and it pairs with the charlotte russe and the petit fours in a way that makes even the most restrained eater at the table reach for one more small thing. Portion control at the dessert course was in theory still important, but the rules relaxed slightly here. The sugar, the candied things, the small elaborate confections, these were the reward for the disciplined eating of the earlier courses. You were allowed to enjoy this. You were even allowed to show that you were enjoying it, which was not always permitted in the earlier parts of the meal, where enthusiasm for food was a mild social liability. There is a woman at the far end of the table who is eating the candied violets with an expression of unguarded pleasure. She is Mrs. Amelia Drayton, 51 years old, widow of a very successful shipping merchant, and she has long since reached the point in her social life where she does not particularly mind being seen to enjoy her food. She has earned this. She comes to these dinners because she enjoys them and she is good company, and she has a clear enough idea of her own position that she does not need to perform anxiety about it. When the violet is good, she allows herself to look like the violet is good. This is in its own quiet way a kind of power. Miss Forsyth, watching Mrs. Drayton from 3 places away, files this away. After dessert comes the final ritual I mentioned earlier, the withdrawal. Margaret sets it in motion. There is no announcement. She does not rise and say, "Ladies, shall we?" She simply catches the eye of Francis Atherton, who is on her right, and there is a small movement of acknowledgement, almost invisible, and then Margaret rises from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and the women rise with her, and the men rise with them, briefly, ceremonially, and then the women move toward the drawing room and the men settle back into their chairs with a subtle collective relaxation. Hargreaves reappears. The port is decanted. The cigars are brought in their case. The claret glasses are replaced with the smaller port glasses. The conversation changes key. It is faster now, more horizontal, less managed. The men at the table without women present speak differently, not badly, not roughly, not in any dramatic way, just differently. The register shifts. Some of the social formality lifts, just slightly, and what appears underneath it is sometimes more interesting and sometimes less interesting than what was there before. In the drawing room, the women arrange themselves on the silk-covered furniture, and the conversation there also shifts. It is warmer here, in both temperature and tone. The drawing room fire has been burning since this afternoon, and the room is soft with it. Coffee arrives on a tray, in small cups, very strong, and there are the last of the petit fours, and a small dish of candied almonds. Margaret is at ease now in a way she has not been since the first carriage arrived. The dinner is done. Whatever happened, happened. The food was good, she knows this. She could tell from the way the table responded to the lamb and the charlotte russe and the champagne. The conversation did not falter in any serious way. Nobody made an error worth talking about, or at least nobody made an error that will be talked about in her house. Whatever is said in other houses, in other carriages on the way home, she cannot control and has stopped trying to. Cordelia Langford is on the settee by the window, telling a story that is making the woman beside her, a young matron named Sarah Calloway, laugh with genuine freedom. Cordelia's stories are always good. That is one of her gifts, narrative, a certain dryly funny way of observing the social world from a position just slightly outside it, that produces a kind of comedy specific to people who know the rules well enough to find them funny. Mrs. Drayton is at the other end of the room discussing the opera with two women who share her enthusiasm for it, and the conversation there is actually serious, drawing on real knowledge and real feeling rather than the managed surface of dinner conversation. This is the drawing room at its best, a space where women can be a certain kind of themselves that the dinner table did not allow. Less observed, less performing, more willing to be odd or specific or genuinely funny. The absence of men is in this hour not a constraint but an opening. The men rejoin them 35 minutes later. The party shifts again, becomes more mixed, and for the next 45 minutes or so it is the evening in its final phase. The conversation after the dinner, after the dessert, after the port, a more free-floating gathering that feels less like a performance and more like the quiet end of something that has worked. Around 11, the Athertons begin the departure. This is the correct thing. They are the senior couple, and their departure is the signal. Within 20 minutes of their leaving, almost everyone else has made their farewells, collected their wraps from the servants, descended the stairs to the waiting carriages. The footmen are showing people out with the same white-gloved efficiency that showed them in 3 hours ago. Hargreaves sees the last guest to the door himself. The house empties. Margaret stands in the dining room alone for a moment. The table is already being cleared. 2 footmen are moving quietly, removing glasses and plates, the silver centerpiece candle holders, the menu cards that some guests took as souvenirs and some left behind. The roses are still there, more open than they were at dinner, and in the cooling air of the room they release a smell that is the combined smell of all the candle wax and all the wine and all the food, and, faintly underneath it, just the roses themselves, warmer than they should be, sweeter than they started. Cecile will be waiting upstairs. There are 20 buttons to undo and the emeralds to put away, and whatever the next thing is that she has been keeping track of. The morning will come and the morning will have its work, the correspondence to be written, the morning calls to consider, the next dinner to begin thinking about. But for this moment, in the dining room that is slowly being restored to an empty, quiet room, Margaret stands and lets the evening settle around her, not examining it, not yet, just being in it, in the last few minutes of its existence as a thing that is happening. The footmen work around her without comment. Tomorrow the rooms will be as they were. The silver will be polished and returned to the cabinet. The unused wine will go back to the cellar. The roses wilted will be removed. The damask cloth will go to the laundress. The dining room will be a room again, not an occasion. But tonight, for this moment, the candles are still smoking their thin trails into the air, and the roses are open and the chairs are pushed back at odd angles the way chairs always are after people have been sitting in them for 3 hours, and the room still holds the warmth and the smell and the particular atmospheric residue of what it was. A Gilded Age dinner party, a small, concentrated, expensive, elaborate, very human performance. 24 people, 6 hours, 7 wines, 37 candles, and 147 invisible rules. More or less. Stay with me. We are not done yet. There is more of this world to walk through, and I want to walk through it slowly. Let me tell you about Ward McAllister's actual dinner parties, because they deserve their own chapter in this story. McAllister did not only advise, he hosted, and the entertainments he created were, by any standard, extraordinary. He organized what he called fêtes champêtres, outdoor entertainments at his farm in Newport, Rhode Island, where the cream of New York society would arrive to find a pastoral idyll that had been engineered with almost military precision, tables under the trees, lamb roasting on spits. Milkmaids, real ones, hired for the occasion, producing fresh milk and butter for the guests, flowers everywhere, a string quartet, and underneath all of this rusticity, an invisible scaffolding of expense and management that ensured the illusion of simplicity was perfect, because that was the paradox McAllister understood better than almost anyone. The highest expression of Gilded Age social life was not to look expensive, it was to look inimitable. The genuinely grand houses did not seem to be trying, the dinners at the very top did not seem effortful. They seemed simply to be what dinner was supposed to be. The effort was enormous, and it was completely invisible, and making it invisible was itself the highest skill. Mrs. William Astor, whom McAllister served for 3 decades, understood this instinctively. She did not appear to work. She received. She presided. She indicated approval or disapproval through a vocabulary of gestures and expressions so refined that it communicated clearly without ever becoming explicit. If Mrs. Astor turned slightly away from someone she was speaking to, that was a message. If she addressed you in a particular tone, with a particular degree of warmth, that was information the entire room received and processed. Her authority operated through atmosphere rather than statement. Mrs. Astor's ballroom is worth a moment of its own. The ballroom at her house on 5th Avenue and 34th Street was famously the physical origin of McAllister's 400. It held approximately 400 people comfortably. This sounds like a limitation. It was wielded as a standard. If your ballroom holds 400, then 400 is the correct number of people in New York society. If 400 is the correct number, then anyone outside that number is by definition not in society. The arithmetic is circular, but the social consequence is absolute. Mrs. Astor's annual January ball was the event of the season. The invitations sent out in her name in January were the single most significant document in the social calendar of New York. Receiving one was confirmation. Not receiving one was information. And the people who did not receive one but expected to receive one, who had perhaps been receiving them for several years and then suddenly did not, those people had the particular experience of understanding, without it ever being said directly, that something had changed in how they were regarded. The ball itself followed the same logic as the dinner party, but at a larger scale and with more spectacle. A receiving line at the entrance, which was a formal gauntlet in which you presented yourself to the host or hostess and were greeted in a way that established your position, an orchestra, dancing, but not any dancing, the specific dances of the era, the waltz and the cotillion and the quadrille, each with its own choreography and its own social meanings about who you asked and who asked you and who you were seen dancing with, and how many times. Supper at midnight served in the supper rooms adjacent to the ballroom, with food from Delmenico's and champagne in quantities that were, by any measure, significant. And throughout all of it, the same surveillance, the same invisible calculation, the same accumulation of social data that was the real currency of the evening. Who arrived with whom? Who spoke to whom? Who left with whom? What was said and what was not said, and who was present when it was said? The gossip that came out of these occasions was immediate and thorough, and travelled through the social world of New York at a speed that is genuinely impressive, given that there were no telephones to speak of, and no social media, and the primary vehicle for social information was the morning call. That institution we touched on earlier, in which women visited each other in the hours between 11 and 1, and sat in drawing rooms and exchanged the news of the previous evening over tea and cakes. The morning call system is itself a marvel of social engineering. You called on the people above you in the social hierarchy. The people above you received you if they wished through their butler, who would either say "Madam is at home," which meant you were admitted, or "Madam is not at home," which meant you were being declined, regardless of whether Madam was actually at home or not, because "not at home" was a social fiction and everyone knew it was a fiction, and the fiction was the point. Receiving someone's card without admitting them was a message. Admitting someone without being particularly warm was also a message. Being at home with particular warmth was the best message. You left your calling card regardless of whether you were admitted. The cards accumulated in a small silver tray in the entrance hall, and they were reviewed by the household, and they communicated your frequency of calling, your diligence in the social rituals, your position relative to this household. Women of serious social standing received enough calls that they kept a social secretary, or at minimum a careful diary, to track the obligations incurred. Margaret has a social secretary. She is a quiet young woman from a genteel family who fell on reduced circumstances, the kind of situation that was very common in the Gilded Age world. Old family without the money to maintain old standards, which produced a class of educated women who supported themselves as social secretaries and ladies' companions and governesses. The secretary's name is Miss Hubbard, and she sits in a small room off the morning room, with a careful ledger in which every call received and every card left and every note sent and every invitation issued or accepted is recorded. Without Miss Hubbard, the social machinery would seize. The obligations are too numerous and too interrelated to manage in anyone's head. All of this, the cards and the calls and the ledgers and the secretary, and the morning visits with their careful calibrations of warmth and the evening visits with their 14 pieces of silverware per place, all of this is the visible surface of something larger, which is the constant management and maintenance of social position in a world where social position is not inherited and fixed, as it was in Europe, but is continuously earned and continuously at risk. This is the great difference between Gilded Age New York and the English aristocratic world it was trying to imitate. In England, your position was largely given at birth. You were a duke or you were not. You were born at the right address or you were not. The social hierarchy was ancient and encoded, and while it could be navigated with more or less skill, it was ultimately not a meritocracy in any sense. It was a genealogy. New York in the 1880s was different. The very old money was very old, but there was not very much of it, and the old money families were being continuously surrounded by new money, of a scale that old money had never previously encountered. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, these families were generating wealth faster than any English aristocrat could comprehend. And they wanted naturally what wealth has always wanted, which is status. And status in New York was, in principle, available, not easily, not quickly, not without the right manners and the right address and the right dinner parties and the right morning calls and the right clothes and the right silverware, but available. The 400 was not exactly permeable, but it had edges. People got in, and the energy produced by that possibility, the knowledge that the right performance over enough time could change your position, gave the social world of the Gilded Age its peculiar, anxious, brilliant, exhausting quality. Mrs. Astor's own position is instructive here. She was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn before her marriage, from an old Dutch New York family, and she married into the Astor fortune, which was one of the largest in the city. This combination, old family with new money, gave her both the genealogical credentials and the resources to exercise social authority at the highest level. But she was not born to that authority. She assembled it, systematically over decades, through exactly the mechanisms we have been discussing: the dinner parties, the ballroom, the calling cards, the carefully managed warmth and withdrawal, the alliance with McAllister, who brought organizational genius to her instinctive social authority. By the time we reach the period we are talking about, the 1880s, her position was so established that it operated almost independently of anything she actively did. She had become the standard. You measured things against her and not the other way round. And yet even Mrs. Astor, at the summit of the social world she had built, was not entirely secure. The Vanderbilts were coming. The new money was enormous, and it was insistent, and it would not be kept out forever. The famous Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, the costume ball given by Alva Vanderbilt, who had not yet been received by Mrs. Astor, and who used the ball as the occasion that forced Mrs. Astor to call first. And when Mrs. Astor left a calling card at the Vanderbilt house, which she did, because she wanted her daughter to be invited to the ball, The Vanderbilts had won their entry. It is, depending on your perspective, a story about social ambition or social flexibility, or just the relentless arithmetic of money eventually winning against every other form of currency. But it is also a very human story about what people want and how far they will go to get it. Alva Vanderbilt spent $300,000 on that ball. $300,000. In 1883, it is almost impossible to give a modern equivalent because the conversion is so extreme. But a useful reference point is that the average American industrial worker at that time earned about $400 per year. Alva spent the equivalent of approximately 750 working years of income on one evening of entertainment. It was by all accounts extraordinary. The costumes alone were the result of months of preparation. Many guests had commissioned their costumes from Worth in Paris, the same Worth that made Margaret's gown, and travelled to New York wearing them. There was a woman costumed as electricity, with actual electric lights wired into her dress, powered by a small battery she carried concealed in the fabric. There was a man who came as a cat, in a suit made entirely of real cat skins. There was Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II in a gown representing electric light, which she had had specially constructed, and which was, by contemporary accounts, the most discussed costume of the evening. The ball ran all night. By morning, the social world had shifted. Let me bring you back to Margaret's dining room now. Back to the specific and the quiet. We have been ranging across the wider world of Gilded Age New York, and it is time to return to the 37 candles and the wilting roses and the particular intimacy of one woman standing in her dining room at the end of an evening, because all of that history, Mrs. Astor and the 400 and the Vanderbilts and Ward McAllister and the $300,000 ball, all of it is the context in which Margaret gave her dinner tonight. It is the world her dinner exists inside, and the weight of it, the social significance of even a relatively modest 24-person dinner in a good house on Fifth Avenue, is real, and it is heavy, and she carries it every time she sends out an invitation. She knows the rules, as we have been discussing. She knows them the way you know how to breathe. She knows which fork is which, and how to turn at the table, and when to rise, and what not to talk about, and how to calibrate warmth with the precision of a watchmaker. She knows the social history of every person who sat at her table tonight, the alliances and the rivalries and the marriages and the business connections and the social debts owed and collected. She knew it before the first guest arrived, and she will be processing it for days after the last guest left. But she also just gave a dinner, a human dinner, with real food and real wine and real people who sometimes forgot to perform and said something genuine, and a woman who ate the candied violets with unconcealed pleasure, and a young woman who ate too little because she was nervous, and Cordelia Langford telling a story at the far end of the room that made someone laugh with real freedom. Hold both of these things at once, the machine and the human moment, the rule and the person who is tired of the rule, the performance and the thing underneath it that the performance is always, in some sense, trying to protect. That is what Gilded Age New York was. Both things at once, always. Cecile is waiting upstairs. Let me leave Margaret there for a moment, standing in her dining room with the candles going out and the roses open and the footman moving quietly around her. Let me hold that image, and let me take you now into the deeper quiet of the evening. It is past 11. The Whitmore house is emptying of guests, but the street outside is still alive with the movement of the departing carriages, the sound of iron on stone, the last instructions passed between coachman and footman in the cold air. The gas lamps on Fifth Avenue cast their light at intervals, pools of amber in the dark. And between the pools the night is real and close and cold, with the particular quality of October in New York, which is a cold that carries the smell of leaves and stone, and something that is almost, not quite, the smell of winter coming. Inside the house the warmth is still there, not the full warmth of the evening which has begun to ease as windows are cracked and fires bank, but residual warmth, the warmth of a house that has been fully inhabited for several hours, that has held 26 people and an orchestra and a kitchen full of activity, and 7 kinds of wine and all the physical heat of human bodies performing the most elaborate dinner party that any civilization has yet conceived. Cecile meets Margaret at the top of the stairs. She takes the evening wrap without a word. She has the buttons of the green Worth gown open before Margaret has quite settled into the chair at the dressing table. Her fingers quick and practiced, and the emeralds are unclasped and set in their case, and the gloves are removed, and the elaborate coiffure that has been maintaining itself under various pressures for the past 6 hours is finally let down. This is the moment of private return. The same moment that Constance would recognise in London at the end of another kind of evening. The moment the performance ends and the woman is simply a woman, sitting in a chair with her hair loose and her gown open, and the day's final residue of effort dissolving out of her shoulders. The house is almost quiet now. One footman is still moving somewhere below, completing some final task. The kitchen is dark except for the banked range, still holding heat enough to be warm in the morning when the cook arrives to begin again. Hargreaves has made his final round of the ground floor, checking windows and locks with the thoroughness of a man who understands that his job does not end when the guests leave. Margaret's room is lit by a single lamp on the dressing table. Cecile is working quietly, hanging the gown, setting out the things needed for tomorrow. There is no conversation. This too is a ritual, the wordlessness of the end of the evening, the agreement between a woman and her maid that some hours do not require speech. The bed is turned down. The pillows are the particular white of very clean linen. The air in the room is cooler than the dining room was, cooler than the drawing room, because the bedroom window has been cracked open in the way that is simply what you do winter or summer, because fresh air at night is not a luxury, it is a principle. Margaret sits at the dressing table for a moment after Cecile has gone. The dressing table mirror is oval, tilted slightly, and in it she can see the room behind her, the white bed, the shadowed corner, the faint glow of the lamp. She looks at her own face briefly, without the performing frame around it, without the social calculation, just looking. She is 34, she has been at this, the dinners and the calls and the cards and the social management and the calibrated warmth, since she was 22. 12 years. She is good at it. She is genuinely good at it, the way that Cordelia Langford is good at it, with the ease of long practice and real skill. And she finds most evenings that she does not mind it, that there are satisfactions in it, real ones. The satisfaction of a room that worked, a conversation that turned exactly right, a guest who came in anxious and left easier. These are real. But tonight, in the quiet and the lamplight, she is also simply tired, not unhappy, not miserable, just tired with the particular tiredness of someone who has been performing at a high level for 6 hours, which is the tiredness of a musician after a concert or an actor after a show, and which requires not consolation but simply rest. She will sleep well. The dinner was a success. She knows this with the certainty of long experience. The morning will bring the first notes of response, the small social communications that follow a successful evening, and she will read them with the appropriate attention and respond in the appropriate ways. And by the end of next week, the evening will have already receded into the social past, already becoming material for the next planning, the next dinner, the next occasion. But for now, rest. Let the lamp go out. Let the house settle into its nighttime breathing, the slight creak of the stairs as the temperature drops, the whisper of curtains in the draught from the cracked window, the distant sound of the city outside, which never quite goes silent but changes register in the small hours, quieter, slower, more like a city in repose than a city at work. The street is almost empty now. The last carriage has gone. The gas lamps burn on their posts along Fifth Avenue, casting their light on nothing in particular, on the stone facade of the Whitmore house and the stone facades of all the other houses and the stone of the street itself and the empty sky above. The chrysanthemums in the stone urns by the gate are closed now, as chrysanthemums do in the cold, pulling back into themselves for the night. The roses in the dining room are still open. No one is there to see them. The footman who was moving through the room an hour ago has long since finished and gone to his room. The table is cleared. The damask cloth has been removed and folded. The silverware is in the pantry waiting to be polished tomorrow. The last of the 37 candles is a stub of wax in a silver holder. Its thread of smoke curled up into the ceiling air of the room and was gone. In the kitchen, the cold is coming in slowly through the space around the service door. The range ticks quietly as the metal contracts. Someone left a dish towel on the rack above it, folded neatly over the rail, and it hangs there in the dark kitchen, very still. The copper pots are back on their hooks, returned and polished after the work of the day. The sauces that Madame Renard made this morning are in the larder, what is left of them. The bottles that held the wine are lined up in the scullery for removal tomorrow. The kitchen at the end of a dinner party like this one looks very different from the kitchen at the beginning, when it was controlled chaos and heat and the smell of everything cooking at once. Now it is just a room, cool and orderly and quiet. Hargreaves is in his room on the upper floor, already in his night clothes, reading by the light of a small lamp. He will be back at his post by 7 in the morning. This is the pace of his life. The dinner and the night and the morning and another dinner. He has been doing it for 11 years in various households, and he has by now a perfectly calibrated understanding of what each kind of employer needs and what each kind of evening requires, and how to move through the machinery of formal domestic service with the efficiency that comes from long practice. He does not find it demeaning. He finds it most of the time exactly what it is: work, skilled work. Work that requires attention and intelligence and a certain kind of pride in the quality of what you produce. The lamp is out in Margaret's room. The house is in its nighttime darkness. Outside, on the street, a cab horse clops past, pulling someone home from somewhere, and the sound of it is very clear in the quiet, and then it is gone. The October wind moves down Fifth Avenue from the direction of the park. It is a clean wind, carrying nothing but cold and the faint smell of the last leaves still on the trees, and it passes the Whitmore house and continues downtown, where the city is still, in some of its quarters fully awake, and where the people who make the Gilded Age possible are working through the night in ways that never appear on any dinner menu. But that is another story for another night. Tonight stay here, in this house, in this quiet. The dining room is dark, the kitchen is still. Hargreaves is reading. Cecile is asleep. The last carriage is gone. In the drawing room on the settee where Cordelia Langford sat and told the story that made Sarah Calloway laugh, there is a single forgotten glove. White kid, just slightly warm still from the hand that wore it. It will be found in the morning. The morning will know what to do with it. The roses are open in the dark dining room. The candles are out. The evening was a success. Margaret is asleep. Let the house breathe in the dark. Let the city move around it at its nighttime pace, its voices distant and its light scattered across the dark. Let the gas lamps burn on the empty street. Let the cold settle into the stone. The Gilded Age dinner party is over for tonight, but it will begin again. It begins again tomorrow, and the day after, in this house, and the house next door, and the houses down the block, and across the park, and up and down the avenues of a city that is, in this moment, in the middle of becoming itself, assembling the wealth and the architecture and the social machinery of an era that will not last forever, that cannot last forever, that is already in the autumn of 1888, beginning the long process of becoming history. But tonight it is not history. Tonight it is a dining room going dark and a hostess sleeping, and the smell of roses and extinguished candles in the empty air, and a white glove forgotten on a silk settee, and the cold on the stone outside, and the gas lamps burning in the quiet. Sleep now. Let the candles go out. Let the roses close in the morning. Let the silver rest in the pantry. Let the city move through its dark hours with its nighttime gentleness, its carriage sounds and its lamp glow, and its stone buildings standing in the October cold. You were there. You sat at that table. You held the right fork and you broke the bread correctly, and you turned when the hostess turned, and you said the right things in the right directions, and you stayed through all 7 wines, and the Charlotte Russer, and the crystallized violets, and the separation of the women and the port in the library, and the final farewells in the entrance hall with your wrap around your shoulders, and the cold air from the open door, and the carriage waiting. You survived, just barely, but you survived. Rest now. The evening is over. The roses are still. The house is quiet. And somewhere in the dark dining room, in the last breath of the last candle, the 37 small pillars of wax are cooling back to themselves, and the damask fold lines in the tablecloth are the only evidence that a table was ever set there, that 24 people ever sat there, that the silverware was ever counted and arranged and used and cleared, that the wines were ever poured, that the conversation was ever managed, that any of it ever happened at all. But it did happen, and now the house rests, and you rest with it. Good night. The October wind moves down the avenue. The lamps burn. The city breathes. Sleep well, but let me slow down before I let you truly sleep. Because we have been moving at the pace of the dinner itself, which is to say we have been moving quickly from course to course, from person to person, and I want to return to some of what we passed and linger there more deliberately. The dinner deserves it, the era deserves it, and you, I think, are the kind of person who finds that lingering in the specific details of history is itself a form of rest. Let me start with something I only mentioned briefly. The clothes, because to understand a Gilded Age dinner party in New York, you have to understand what it cost physically to dress for one. And I mean cost in the most literal sense. The weight and the restriction and the time and the physical management of a formal evening gown in 1888 was a project of considerable scale, and the women who undertook it every time they left their houses deserved, if nothing else, considerable credit for sheer physical endurance. Margaret's gown tonight, the Greenworth silk, weighed approximately 12 pounds. That is not a guess or an exaggeration. A formal evening gown of this period, with its multiple layers of silk and its boned bodice and its elaborate underskirt and its trained back and its multiple tiers of decoration, weighed somewhere between 10 and 14 pounds, depending on the fabrics and the embellishments. Margaret has been wearing 12 pounds of gown since 7 this evening. She has been standing in it, greeting guests in it, sitting at the dinner table in it for 3 hours, moving between the dining room and the drawing room in it, receiving and saying farewell to guests in it. For 5.5 hours. Underneath it, of course, was the corset of the late Victorian period, which is where we are, is not quite the crushing instrument of popular imagination, or rather it is and it isn't. The best corsets of this period, the ones worn by women like Margaret who could afford the best, were engineered with a kind of skill that modern lingerie designers might find interesting. They were boned with whalebone, which is flexible and strong and forms itself over time to the shape of the body it is fitted to. They were made to measure by corsetiers who took a dozen measurements and produced a garment that fit with the precision of a piece of architecture, and they created a silhouette that was the foundation of everything else, because in 1888 no gown, no matter how beautifully made, looked right without the correct understructure beneath it. But they were restrictive. The waist was compressed. Breathing was, not impossible, but managed differently. Sitting and bending required thought. A woman in a fully laced corset could not simply slump. She sat upright. She stood erect. The corset enforced the posture that the social world required. There is something deeply interesting in this, and I keep returning to it. The physical discipline that the clothing imposed and the social discipline that the evening required were not separate things. They were continuous. The corset enforced the posture that the dining room expected. The dining room expected posture that the social world rewarded. The social world rewarded a certain kind of managed, controlled, upright femininity that the clothing was designed to produce. It was a closed system, internal and external constraints reinforcing each other until the line between what was required and what was natural was very difficult to draw. Women of this period spoke about their corsets in terms that range widely. Some experienced them as genuinely painful. as restrictive in ways that affected breathing and digestion and the ability to engage in any vigorous physical activity. Some experienced them as simply what clothes felt like, as much a part of getting dressed as shoes, something you put on and stopped noticing. Some experienced the lacing of the corset, the drawing in of the waist, as a ritual of preparation, a putting on of the day's armor, which made sense given what the day required. What none of them experienced, at the level of society we are talking about, was the choice not to wear one. This is the thing to hold. The choice did not exist, or it existed only in the most private moments, in the bedroom before dressing and after undressing, and in a very few contexts of informal private life. For any public occasion, for any visit, for any morning call or afternoon tea or evening dinner, the corset was as assumed as the gown above it. To appear without correct stays was to signal something about yourself that no woman in this world wanted to signal. The gloves. These also deserve a moment. At a formal dinner like Margaret's, women wore gloves throughout the receiving and the pre-dinner drawing room gathering, and they wore them during dinner for the first courses, removing them at some point, or in some versions of the custom keeping them on throughout except when actually eating. The conventions around gloves at table varied slightly by household and by season and by the particular authority structure of the city you were in. What was consistent was that gloves were not decoration, they were statement. Long white kid gloves reaching past the elbow were the visual signature of the formal occasion. They communicated that you had dressed for this. They communicated your understanding of the level of the event. And they were, because they were white kid and because they were long, impossibly difficult to keep clean, which meant they were expensive to maintain and that only women with the means to replace or professionally clean them frequently could wear them as casually as they were supposed to look. The long glove also created a curious social dynamic at the dinner table. Eating while wearing gloves is manageable but not comfortable, and the question of when exactly to remove them and where to put them while they were removed, and how to manage the silverware transition, was one of those small operational challenges of the Gilded Age dinner that produced very specific etiquette guidance in the manuals of the period, and was in practice handled by each woman according to her own well-practiced system. Frances Atherton slips hers off at the fish course and tucks them into her lap. This is correct. The gloves fold easily because they are good quality, and in her lap they become invisible, and the rest of the evening she eats bare-handed in a way that is perfectly proper for the dinner table and would be quite incorrect anywhere else in this building. Now let me tell you about the food in more detail, because we moved through the courses earlier with some speed and I want to give them their proper weight, because the food at a Gilded Age dinner party was not just fuel, it was argument. It was the physical manifestation of the claim being made by the evening, which was the claim that this household was serious, educated, wealthy, and cosmopolitan, and that its hospitality operated at the highest available standard. The French menu card. Let us start there. At a formal dinner in the 1880s, the menu was printed in French, not because the food was necessarily French, though much of it was, and not because the guests necessarily spoke French, though many of them did, or could manage a convincing approximation. The French menu existed because French was the international language of gastronomy, the way that Latin had once been the international language of scholarship, and printing your menu in French was a way of saying that you understood this, that you participated in this, that your kitchen and your household were operating in the same register as the great restaurants and great houses of Paris. This was not always comfortable. There were guests at tables like Margaret's who could not quite read the French menu and had to work it out by a combination of limited vocabulary and context clues and occasional discreet assistance from a more linguistically confident neighbour. The menus were, in fact, sometimes more elaborate in their French than in their actual content, which created the slightly comedic situation of a dish with a simple name, roast lamb, appearing on the card as something that required a paragraph and 3 subordinate clauses to describe in the elegant language of the Parisian menu. The gap between the pretension and the reality was not always lost on the more cynical guests. Ward McAllister, who spent significant time in France and who was genuinely knowledgeable about French gastronomy, used his menus as instructional documents. He published some of them in his book, and reading them now is a kind of time travel, each dish name carrying the specific cultural cargo of the 1880s. Potage bisque d'écrevisse, huître en coquille, filet de sole à la Colbert, selle d'agneau au primeur, sorbet au kirsch. These are not just food items, they are coordinates in a very particular cultural landscape. The sorbet course deserves its own mention. Between the fish and the meat course at a formal dinner, there often appeared a palate cleanser, a small serving of sorbet, usually fruit-flavoured, sometimes punched with a spirit. The Kirsch sorbet, made with the cherry brandy from Alsace, was fashionable in New York in the 1880s. It arrived in small silver cups and was consumed in a few deliberate spoonfuls, and was intended to cleanse the mouth of the richness of the fish and prepare it for the weight of the meat. The men sometimes accompanied it with a small cigarette, which was briefly acceptable in the dining room before the formal dinner etiquette of the era restricted smoking to after the ladies withdrew. The sorbet course was also, informally, a social pause. It interrupted the rhythm of the eating long enough for the conversation to shift, for someone to launch a new subject, for the room to breathe between the register of the fish course and the heavier, richer atmosphere of the roast. Experienced hosts used it deliberately. The 5 minutes of the sorbet course were the intermission in the 3-act structure of the formal dinner. I want to tell you now about the staff who produced all of this, because they are almost entirely invisible in the accounts of these evenings, and they were, in the most practical sense, the reason the evening was possible at all. Madame Renard, the cook, arrived at the Whitmore kitchen at 5 in the morning. This is not unusual. For a dinner of this scale and complexity, preparation began before dawn. The stocks and the sauces, which are the foundation of French-inflected cooking, require hours of slow work. A proper sauce for a saddle of lamb requires a reduction that takes several hours and produces, from several quarts of liquid, a few cupfuls of intensely flavoured, glistening, satiny sauce that is concentrated and delicate and will not survive reheating without very careful management. You make it on the day. You make it carefully. You treat it with respect. Madame Renard has 3 kitchen maids working under her tonight, which is a relatively modest brigade for a dinner of this size. Larger establishments might have 5 or 6 kitchen staff for an occasion like this. What Madame Renard lacks in numbers, she compensates in organization, moving through the kitchen with the precision of long experience, producing from a single cooking range and its connected ovens and water reservoirs, a sequence of courses that when they leave the kitchen look effortless. They are not effortless. The Charlotte Russe alone took 4 hours of intermittent attention, and the moment of unmoulding it, the conversion from mould to plate, has to happen with enough time before service that the cream has settled, but not so much time that it has begun to weep. Madame Renard times these things by a combination of experience and instinct that cannot be reduced to a written recipe. She knows when the Charlotte Russe is ready, the way a musician knows when the tempo is right. It cannot be fully explained. It is the knowledge of a craft practiced for many years. The kitchen in the Whitmore house is in the basement. This is standard for houses of this period on Fifth Avenue. The service areas, the kitchen and the scullery and the pantry and the butler's room are below the level of the street, accessible through a separate entrance at the side of the house that the Whitmore family never uses and their guests never see. The kitchen itself is large by the standards of the period, with a range that runs on coal and produces both dry oven heat for roasting and wet steam for the various boiling and poaching operations that French cooking requires, and a preparation table of scrubbed pine that takes up the centre of the room, and around which the kitchen maids move with the practiced choreography of people who have learnt to be in the same space without impeding each other. The smells in that kitchen at 6 in the evening, 2 hours before the first guest arrives, are something I find genuinely difficult to leave behind. The deep, savoury smell of the lamb stock that has been reducing since midday, the sweetness of the cream being whipped for the Charlotte Russe, the sharp, clean smell of the fresh herbs being chopped at the preparation table, The coal smoke from the range, not unpleasant when you are used to it, warmer and more complex than wood smoke and less sharp than gas. Underneath all of it, the faint cold smell of the marble floor and the stone walls of the basement, which hold the temperature differently from the rooms above. The kitchen is very warm. The kitchen is always very warm when a dinner of this scale is in progress. The range produces enormous heat and the space is not large enough for it to dissipate quickly, and the kitchen maids are in cotton dresses and aprons that are damp within an hour of starting work. But no one says anything about this. The heat is part of the job. The dampness is part of the job. This is what the kitchen is, you manage it. The contrast between the kitchen and the dining room is absolute. 250 feet away, everything is cool silk and silver and measured warmth. Here it is heat and steam and the organized urgency of serious cooking. Both are required. Both produce the same evening, but only one is visible. Thomas, one of the footmen, carries each course up the back stairs that connect the kitchen to the pantry on the first floor. And from the pantry Hargreaves orchestrates the service with the timing of a conductor. Each dish leaves the pantry at the moment he determines, not a moment earlier, not a moment later. He has been doing this for 11 years. His timing is very good. The back stairs are narrow and steep, and if you have ever tried to carry a large, heavy tray up a steep, narrow staircase while wearing formal livery and white gloves, you have some appreciation for the skill this requires. Thomas has climbed these stairs perhaps 10,000 times. He does not think about it. His body knows the stairs. He goes up and comes down and goes up and comes down through the entire 3 hours of the dinner, and the guests in the dining room see the result of each trip and do not see the trip itself, and this invisibility is not an accident. It is the design, the labor that makes the elegance possible must not be visible, because the point of the elegance is that it appears to be effortless, and effort is the one thing that the people being served are not supposed to be aware of. I find this one of the most interesting structural tensions in the whole world we are looking at. The extraordinary effort required to produce the appearance of effortlessness. The vast invisible machinery of labor required to maintain the illusion of natural grace. It is present everywhere in the Gilded Age, not just in the kitchen. The morning calls that look casual required an entire support structure of morning room management and card tray policing and butler briefings. The ballroom dancing that looked spontaneous was preceded by weeks of cotillion practice. The hostess, who seems simply to be at ease in her house, has actually been planning this evening for 3 weeks, and the dinner that seems to flow from course to course like water has been the result of 100 separate acts of preparation by people who will sleep in the basement tonight and begin again at 5 tomorrow morning. Ward McAllister, to his credit, understood this. He wrote about the labor of hospitality with a certain clear-eyed honesty that some of his contemporaries lacked. He knew that the dinners he organized and attended did not produce themselves. He knew that the fish did not arrive at the table through magic, and he did not pretend otherwise in his writing, which is one of the reasons his book is still interesting to read, because it occasionally parts the curtain just slightly and lets you see the machinery operating behind the performance. He also understood something else, which is that the ability to afford the machinery was itself a form of power. The great hostesses of the Gilded Age were powerful partly because they had the money to sustain the infrastructure that made the performance possible. Mrs. Astor's ballroom was not just a beautiful room, it was a statement of resources. The 400 people in it were there in part because she could accommodate 400 people. If her resources had produced a smaller ballroom, the 400 would have been a smaller number. Power in the Gilded Age came in several currencies. Hereditary position, which was limited in America as we discussed, financial resources, which were enormous, and social capital, which was the compound interest on the first two, built up over time through exactly the mechanisms we have been examining. The dinner parties and the morning calls and the balls and the charity committees and the correctly returned invitations and the appropriate warmth calibrated to the appropriate people. Social capital could be accumulated. It could also be lost. This is the anxiety at the center of the Gilded Age social world. the anxiety that makes Miss Forsyth eat too little and calibrate her conversation with such painful precision. Social position in this world was not a fixed state. It was a continuous performance that had to be sustained, or it would decay. You could be received by Mrs. Astor one season and not the next. You could attend 5 dinners at this level, and then, through some combination of social misadventure and reduced circumstances, and the silent operation of the social judgment of your peers, find the invitations coming less frequently, and then not at all. The people who fell were rarely told why. That was not how it worked. There was no announcement, no formal exclusion. There was simply the gradual thinning of invitations, the morning calls that were returned less promptly, the morning room that was, when you called, perhaps not quite as immediately available as it had been, the hostess who was, more often than before, not at home. These small signals accumulated into an understanding that was unmistakable but never stated, and the person receiving them had to manage that understanding alone, without any avenue for appeal, because there was no court of appeal. There was only the social world and its invisible judgments. Eugenia Price Mortimer, who arrived tonight without her husband, and who managed this arrival with the kind of ease that comes from knowing your position is secure enough to withstand small irregularities, has watched several women fall in her 23 years of social navigation. She has watched them fall without entirely understanding why, or understanding partially but not completely. She has never entirely understood the mechanism. She suspects that no one does, that the mechanism is distributed through the network of social judgments in a way that produces collective outcomes without any single person directing them. She has been careful for 23 years to be well liked rather than merely well regarded. There is a difference, and she grasped it early. You can be well regarded for your husband's position or your family's connections or your household's social standing. Well liked is harder and more durable. It requires that people actually enjoy your company, that you produce in the rooms you enter a quality of atmosphere that people want to be around again. Eugenia makes rooms better. This is the simplest description of it. She arrives and something loosens slightly. Some collective tension of performance eases, and people find themselves saying things they were not planning to say and enjoying the evening more than they expected. This is a gift. It is also a skill that has been deliberately developed, though she would not put it that way. She would say she enjoys people, which is true. She does. She finds people genuinely interesting, and that genuine interest communicates itself and produces the ease that makes her socially valuable in a world where social ease is scarce and highly prized. She is the last guest to leave Margaret's house tonight. She says her farewells in the entrance hall with the unhurried warmth of someone who has nowhere urgently to be, and who is genuinely happy to have spent the evening in this company. She says something specific to Margaret. Something about the lamb and the way Madame Renard's sauce managed to be both rich and somehow light at the same time, which is exactly right and which Margaret receives with a pleasure that is entirely unperformed. Eugenia knows what to say. She always knows what to say. It is one of the things about her. When she is in her carriage and she is gone, and the door is closed behind her, and the house is Margaret's alone. Now let me take you deeper into the history of this world, because there is one aspect of the Gilded Age dinner party we have been circling without quite examining directly, and I think it is time to look at it plainly. The question of who was not at the table. I mentioned earlier that the Gilded Age New York dinner party was a sorting mechanism. It sorted who belonged and who did not. But the sorting was not random. It operated along very specific lines of race and ethnicity and religion and class. And these lines were not invisible to the people who drew them. They were deliberate, they were defended, and they produced exclusions that were brutal in their thoroughness. The social world of Mrs. Astor's New York, the world of the 400 and the Fifth Avenue dinner parties and the Delmonico's menus and the Ward McAllister protocols, was a white Protestant world. This was not coincidental, it was constructed. The old Dutch and English families who had settled New York in the 17th and 18th centuries and who formed the social core of the city in the 19th century, drew their circle with the clear intention of keeping it. The Catholic Irish families who arrived after the famine, even the ones who had succeeded spectacularly in business or politics, were not in that circle. The Jewish families, some of them with fortunes that equaled or exceeded the Astors and the Vanderbilts, were not in that circle. The newly arrived Italian and German and Eastern European immigrants who were transforming the character of the city were not in that circle. And the black New Yorkers who had been part of the city's life since its earliest days were not only not in that circle, but were excluded from the public life of the city in ways that were encoded in law and custom and the quiet, merciless operation of daily humiliation. This is not comfortable to hold alongside the elegance of the dinner party, but it has to be held, because the elegance and the exclusion are not separate things. They are the same thing seen from different sides. The beauty of the table and the precision of the social rituals and the 37 candles and the Worth gowns are meaningful only within a social order that decided, very deliberately, who was allowed to participate in them and who was not. The gatekeeping and the dinner party are the same project. Frederick Douglass, who was one of the great American voices of the 19th century and who was, in the 1880s, a man of enormous accomplishment and national stature, was not welcome in the social world we have been visiting tonight. He was not welcome because of his race, and this fact was not a private discomfort but a public policy, maintained by the social institutions of the era with the same rigor that maintained the correct sequence of wines and the proper angle of the butter knife. This does not make the people at Margaret's dinner table villains in any simple sense. Most of them were operating within the assumptions of their world without examining them, which is what most people do in most eras, and the work of examining those assumptions was available to them if they sought it out. But the dinner table was not the place where that work happened, and the social infrastructure they all participated in did not encourage it. But it is worth sitting with the discomfort. The world we have been visiting is genuinely beautiful, in the sense that beautiful things were produced within it. The food and the silver and the Worth gowns and Madame Renard's sauce and the long-stemmed roses and the crystal that caught the candlelight in a way that made the room glow. These are real, and they were produced within a structure that was in its fundamental organization unjust. These two things are both true, and the most honest way to understand this era is to hold them both at once, without resolving the tension into something tidier than it actually was. The Gilded Age ended. It did not end all at once, but it ended in the way that historical periods end, through the slow accumulation of forces that change the world faster than social rituals can adapt. The great fortunes were redistributed, partially through taxation and economic change. The social world of the 400 dissolved under the pressure of new money and new immigration and the democratizing forces of the 20th century. Mrs. Astor died in 1908, and Ward McAllister had already gone before her in 1895. The house on Fifth Avenue where the ballroom stood was eventually demolished to build the Empire State Building, which is itself a kind of summary of the century. But in the autumn of 1888, none of that has happened yet. Tonight, in the Whitmore house, it is simply late. The city is moving through its nighttime self. The candles are out. The roses are open in the dark, and all of that history, the weight and the beauty and the exclusion and the extraordinary human effort and the Charlotte Russe and the 37 candles and the 7 wines and the invisible glove on the settee, all of it is settling into the past, the way that all present moments settle into the past, slowly and then all at once. Stay here for a while. There is no need to move quickly. The night is long and the house is quiet, and the October air is coming through the cracked window in Margaret's bedroom with the smell of leaves and cold stone. Let your mind move through the rooms we visited tonight. The dining room with its scented candles and its damask cloth and its 14 pieces of silverware per place. The drawing room where Eugenia told her story and Cordelia sat and the women breathed differently without the men in the room. The kitchen 2 floors below where Madame Renard has been since 5 this morning, and where the copper pots are back on their hooks and the range is ticking into silence. Let the footmen settle into their beds in the upper stories. Let Hargreaves turn the last page of his book and reach for the lamp. Let Cecile finish whatever small task she has set herself before sleep, and fold her hands and close her eyes. Let the house breathe. The sounds at this hour in a house like this one are very specific. The settling of the wooden floors as the temperature drops, a sound like a very quiet knocking that is entirely the house speaking to itself. The faint rattle of a window in its frame where the cold presses against it from outside. The tick of the mantel clock in the drawing room, the only clock in the house still keeping time in the dark, measuring out the small hours with its patient repetition. The breath of the wind along the facade. These sounds are below the threshold of notice in the daytime. At this hour they are the whole world. It is around 2 in the morning. The city outside has shifted into its deepest register. The carriage traffic on Fifth Avenue has not entirely stopped. Not in New York, not even at this hour, but it has thinned to something occasional and soft. A single cab moves past, its iron wheels making less noise than they would at noon, because the street is mostly empty and the sound has nowhere to bounce. The horse's hooves fall softly on the stone. The lamp on the cab sways with the movement. Then nothing. Then another cab, further away. Then nothing again. The gas lamps on the street burn with their steady amber light. They burn all night. They were lit at dusk by the lamp lighter who makes his circuit each evening, and they will burn until shortly before dawn when the overnight watchman makes the opposite circuit and begins extinguishing them. In the meantime they illuminate nothing in particular. The empty street, the stone facade of the house, the stone urns with the chrysanthemums, the iron gate that is closed and locked for the night. Inside the locked gate, inside the stone house, something very quiet is happening. The roses in the dining room are releasing their last night perfume. This is a real thing. Flowers produce different scents at different hours, and the rose family in particular often intensifies its scent in the dark hours of the night when the air is still. In the dining room of the Whitmore house, the 30 roses of the centerpiece arrangement, opened fully now in the warmth that still lingers in the room after hours of candles and bodies and wine, are releasing a smell that is very different from the contained, decorative smell they produced during the dinner. Warmer, slightly overripe, the smell of flowers that are at their peak and beginning the very first movement toward past their peak, which is sometimes the most beautiful moment for a rose. The October wind is cool at the window. The gas lamps are burning in the street. The city is almost still, and somewhere in the dark of the dining room, in the warmth that is the last warmth, the roses are still open, still breathing, still giving what they have to give, even in the dark, even with no one there to receive it. Sleep now. The evening is over, and it was beautiful, and it was enough, and the October night is long and quiet and cool and clean, and you are warm, and the candles are out. Good night.